Welcome, everyone, to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and when we last left with Jackson, he was faced with a decision. Being outnumbered 6-1, would he stand and fight at Winchester or retreat? In this episode, you will hear about the first engagement in the Valley Campaign. Nathaniel Banks's division and brigade commanders chomped at the bit to attack Jackson at Winchester, but he held them back, preferring to force Jackson to evacuate Winchester without a fight. Besides, not all of Sedgwick's brigades were up, and with McClellan capturing Manassas and Johnston's Confederate army pulling back to Culpeper, the advantage was firmly on the side of the Union. After Lander succumbed to a combination of pneumonia and the bullet wound, Brigadier General James Shields took command of his division. Shields, an Irish immigrant who met Abraham Lincoln on the dueling grounds at one point and who fought gallantly in the Mexican-American War, being wounded twice, seemed a natural choice as a brigadier general of volunteers. The Union brigades and division commanders who pressed up the valley to Winchester planned to go against Banks's orders not to attack and assault the Confederate works on the morning of March 12th. On March 11th, Jackson's brigades marched to the north end of town and took up their positions in their makeshift entrenchments. Stonewall sent the wagons south of the town, where the men would travel through the town from their positions to get supper before returning to the entrenchments. Jackson formulated a plan to launch a night attack against the Federals just to the north and held a council of war to see what his brigade commanders thought of the plan. None of his subordinates thought a night attack a good idea, infuriating Jackson. Then, some of his officers told him that without knowing what Jackson's intentions were, the supply wagons didn't stop on the south side of town and continued for 5 miles, and the regiments marched after them, following the commander's orders to get something to eat. Jackson's refusal to tell his subordinates his plan had cost him the ability to launch the attack he wanted. At midnight, he issued the needless order to evacuate Winchester. Many of his troops were already on their way south. He declared that he would never hold another council of war, and rode south with his surgeon Hunter McGuire. At 3 a.m., the exhausted Jackson sat down in a fence corner and went to sleep. Later that morning, Union forces cautiously entered Winchester. The town was theirs. Unionists hung United States flags from their windows, and secessionists cursed the Yankee soldiers in the street. One young secessionist lady nearly walked underneath a United States flag. One of her friends asked if she would walk under such a dirty rag. She replied never, and went out of her way to not walk under it. A Union soldier nearby shouted, "Missus, I think you have a dirtier rag under the skirts of your dresses." The Army of the Valley encamped near Cedar Creek, and Jackson became concerned he still remained too close to the larger Union force and moved just north of Mount Jackson to Red Banks, one of the largest and most impressive homes in the valley. Jackson kept in mind Johnston's order to keep Banks busy so that he did not reinforce McClellan. Stonewall would need to stay far enough away from Banks to give himself enough freedom of movement, yet close enough that Banks didn't think he'd left the valley. A reorganization of the Army of the Potomac, brought on by a contention between Abraham Lincoln and George McClellan, resulted in reducing the valley of Federal troops. McClellan planned to land at Fort Monroe on the peninsula formed by the James and York Rivers, but before he did, Lincoln wanted him to secure Washington, D.C., and place a significant force at Manassas to thwart any attempt by the Confederates to attack Washington. McClellan wanted Banks to occupy that location, and Sedgwick's division left Banks's corps, leaving just Alpheus Williams and James Shields' divisions in the valley, but that was soon to change if Jackson could be ousted from the valley. Under orders, James Shields scouted south of Winchester to Strasburg, capturing the town but being contested every step of the way by Turner Ashby's 700 horsemen and Chew's battery. Shields' force numbered over 8,000 men, but Ashby delayed them significantly with mostly just one artillery battery. Union soldiers could spot the young cavalier atop his white horse, supervising his artillery. One Union soldier wrote, "This Ashby was the terror and the wizard of the Shenandoah. He was represented as being always mounted on a white horse, of being everywhere present, and of wearing a charmed life. Consequently, everything astride a white horse in front, in rear, along the mountains, near at hand, or in the distance, was at once conjured up in the minds of the soldiers to be Ashby. His apparition had presented itself frequently during the day, and still hovered about fitfully in the advance. On March 20th, Shields marched his division back to Winchester. He and Banks were exceedingly happy with the reconnaissance, and mused that they had seen the last of Jackson. Williams's division departed for Centerville, leaving Shields alone at Winchester. While at Mount Jackson, Stonewall got a small group of reinforcements, militia called up by the governor of Virginia, John Letcher, to support Jackson. The 400 men would help, but one man from the militia would be worth more than all the others combined. Jedediah Hotchkiss, a native New Yorker, had moved to the Shenandoah Valley years earlier as a teacher, geologist, and cartographer. He made a map for Robert E. Lee when that general campaigned in western Virginia, and now, very soon, Jackson would use him to make maps of the Shenandoah Valley. On March 22nd, Jackson marched north, concentrating his small army of around 4,000 men at Strasburg. There, he waited for reports from Ashby, scouting in front. The cavalrymen engaged with Federals on the south side of Winchester, prompting Shields to ready his division for combat and sending Kimball's brigade to engage the enemy. During the heavy skirmishing and artillery duel, an artillery shell knocked Shields unconscious and wounded him. He would come to only to pass out from the pain. By night, Ashby retreated and informed Jackson that only a skeleton force occupied Winchester and that they were preparing to leave for Harper's Ferry. None of that information was true. Shields' whole division occupied Winchester, and neither he nor Banks was preparing to move north. Jackson knew that he needed to keep as many Federals in the valley as possible to keep them from moving east to support McClellan, and the best way to do that was to attack and force Banks to come after him. The morning of March 23rd dawned, and Kimball assumed Ashby had fled and sent out a scouting party to the south. The scouts found Ashby had returned, this time with infantry. Ashby's cavalry and infantry went out into a skirmish line around the community of Kernstown. Seeing the tactical value of Pritchard's Hill lying northwest of Kernstown, Kimball ordered 3 artillery batteries to that hill. Knowing artillery alone could not throw back Ashby, he ordered forward the untested 67th Ohio, who had yet to see combat, and the 5th Ohio from Sullivan's brigade to secure his artillery atop Pritchard's Hill. It was now 9 a.m., and the two sides threw artillery shells at one another, while Ashby concocted a plan. He thought only 4 Federal regiments remained in the town, so most of the infantry and artillery must now be on the field. Therefore, he thought he could flank them and press on to Winchester. Ashby shifted his infantry and cavalry to the east of the Valley Turnpike, and then began to engage with Federal skirmishers. They initially gained an advantage on the blue troops, but then Kimball called forward the 14th Indiana. The men from Indiana rushed down the Valley Pike and then deployed into line of battle, delivering significant volleys into the great troops. Despite the resistance, Ashby still thought that a small force remained around Winchester. He broke off his flanking movement, and the 14th Indiana, 8th Ohio, and 5th Ohio pursued the rebels a short distance. Jackson confidently pushed his infantry down the Valley Pike toward Kernstown, confident in victory. He wrote to Johnston that he hoped to be in Winchester by the evening. Banks was still at Winchester, but believed this nothing more than cavalry and left for Washington. Shields remarked that Jackson would not fight, that Jackson was afraid of him. At the behest of Kimball, Colonel Jeremiah Sullivan marched his brigade in battle line south and formed on Kimball's left, across the pike. Kimball also wanted to reinforce his position and sent the 84th Pennsylvania to the junction of Pritchard's Lane and the Middle Road. Jackson arrived at the battlefield around noon and thought he may delay attacking until the next morning since it was Sunday, and he did not want to fight on a Sabbath. However, when he gazed through his field glasses, he could see Union artillery silhouetted on Pritchard Hill. The infantry remained just out of sight. Still acting on Ashby's earlier report that only a small group of Federals guarded the town, Jackson moved his 3,000 infantry down the Valley Pike. Before his men got within rifle range of the guns perched atop Pritchard's Hill, he sent Fulkerson's brigade in front with the Stonewall Brigade under Richard Garnett west of the pike and his artillery, supported by Burke's brigade, to the east. He hoped to turn the Union right flank and drive them from the field. The 5th Virginia from the Stonewall Brigade and the 48th Virginia from Burke's brigade were held back in reserve to guard the wagon train. Shields, from his sick bed, recovering from his fractured arm, sent messages to Kimball to attack. Kimball could see the situation was much more grave than Shields thought and refused to launch an attack. Between 1:30 and 2 o'clock, Fulkerson's 2-regiment brigade, with the Stonewall Brigade supposedly behind, advanced on the Union position. The exposed position of the Virginians forced Fulkerson to seek shelter in some trees, where his command got pelted with artillery shells for around 30 minutes. Garnett rode with the commander of the 33rd Virginia, his lead regiment, but did not communicate the role of the rest of the brigade to his regimental commanders. What resulted was the rest of the brigade stayed put while the 33rd advanced into the same open ground that Fulkerson had and were hit with significant artillery fire. They darted onto Sandy Ridge with no other help around. Jackson took command of the Stonewall Brigade and ordered Sandy Pendleton to get them en route. He organized the 2nd and 4th Virginia to advance towards Sandy Ridge, encountering the same artillery as the other two regiments. Concerned that the Union commander may see him massing infantry on Sandy Ridge, Jackson ordered Ashby's cavalry to attack the Union left flank, but with only 150 troopers at his disposal, he did little more than gain the attention of Kimball, which was exactly what Jackson needed, a diversion. The cavalrymen then pulled back to safety. Jackson now began to move the rest of his force to Sandy Ridge. It was around 3 p.m. when the 1st Virginia, 27th Virginia, and 21st Virginia shuffled to the left of Jackson's line, along with the artillery prepared to unleash fury upon the Federal troops. Jackson had the artillery stop and counter the Union gunners' fire, which sent the infantry fleeing to the backside of Pritchard Hill. Jackson clapped his hands, exclaiming, "Good, good." From atop Sandy Ridge, Sandy Pendleton of Jackson's staff could see beyond Pritchard Hill and was astonished to see at least 10,000 Union soldiers. He informed Jackson, who told him to say nothing. Then the general stated, "We are in for it." Pendleton counted 5 regimental flags approaching Sandy Ridge. Something needed to be done to thwart their advance. With Garnett nowhere to be found, Jackson ordered forward the 27th Virginia to support the batteries perched on Sandy Ridge to protect them from the approaching infantry. They lined up along a stone wall and prepared themselves. The Union brigade approaching the Virginians was under Erastus Tyler. The Ohioan did not deploy his brigade into battle line. He also was not aware of the infantry laying in his front. He thought he was simply going to outflank the artillery on Sandy Ridge. When his men entered the forest on Sandy Ridge, they encountered skirmishers and the main line of Virginians. One Ohioan described it as a tornado 10 times intensified when the musketry hit them. Confusion reigned in Tyler's brigade as the first two regiments bumped into one another, causing the lines of men to intermingle. Officers attempted to extricate their companies from the others, and many of the 7th Ohio shuffled into a ravine to protect themselves from bullets. As the bullets whizzed over the heads of the other regiments, the 1st Virginia held firm, but the 110th Pennsylvania fled to the rear, despite attempts to bring them back to the front. Jackson scoured the battlefield, attempting to unite his entire army in their stance on Sandy Ridge. He found and ordered forward the 21st Virginia, who took up a position on the right of the 27th, followed by the 23rd and 37th Virginia, who took up a position on the left of the line. Tyler attempted to extend his line to the right by ordering the 1st Virginia to the west, which they promptly did, but as they formed and advanced toward the stone wall, their colonel went down with an arm wound, which caused the regiment to halt and fall back. The reason Jackson personally ordered the regiments forward was because he could not find Richard Garnett. Garnett was attempting to locate all of his regiments who got separated during the early stages of the battle and would personally lead the 33rd and 4th Virginia to the stone wall, placing them alongside their embattled comrades. Eventually, Jackson would get the 2nd Virginia Regiment and the 1st Virginia Battalion, also known as the Irish Battalion, to the stone wall. The Confederate battle line was now about 500 yards long, and even though they were positioned behind a great barrier, the regiments took considerable punishment. It was 4:30 p.m. and Jackson assessed the situation. He repulsed Tyler's brigade, but he was still outnumbered. However, he did have 3 regiments in reserve. If he could hold out for another 2 hours, when darkness would cover the field, he could at least hope for a draw. He wagered that Kimball couldn't get another attack organized in the last few hours of the day. He was wrong, but not by much. Kimball sent the 3 regiments guarding Pritchard Hill to charge the Confederate position. The attack went awry almost immediately when Kimball ordered his bugler to sound recall. Some of the companies heard that order and came back to Pritchard Hill, which reduced the number of men committed to battle. Furthermore, the 84th Pennsylvania, who had a mutiny previous to the battle and entered the engagement with many of its officers absent, melted away when confronted by the Confederate bullets. The 5th Ohio lost 9 flag bearers as they advanced and fought against Jackson's lines. Kimball sent in the 14th Indiana to shore up the battle line, but that regiment was led by a drunk lieutenant colonel named William Harrow. One soldier stated that he was so drunk he had no idea what he was doing, which proved true when the first volley he ordered was into the backs of the 5th Ohio. After that debacle, the 14th Indiana slid to the left of the Ohioans as the 3 regiments moved up the hill toward the stubborn Confederates. It was about 6 p.m. and quickly growing dark. Paul Truckee, a 6-foot 6-inch Hoosier, was overcome with excitement and waved his infield over his head and yelled, "Come on, boys!" One of his comrades described him as wild as a deer, ran headlong after the rebels as a dog would chase a rabbit, loading and firing as he went. The regiment slammed into the Confederate line, which began to give way. Union soldiers began to charge on their own accord, chasing after the rebels. Two soldiers found themselves way out in front of the Union line when a bullet ricocheted off a tree and hit one of them. The uninjured man described the scene. He was a good-sized fat boy, and when he fell, he made a noise like a ball and calf. I sprang to him, and having thought I had heard the bullet strike and fall to the ground, I did not understand why he looked so lifeless. I felt his limb and soon found the dent the ball made. I then came to the conclusion that the blow had stopped the circulation, and I began rubbing the limb strongly. Within a moment or two, Dave's eyes began to open, and he exclaimed, "Doggone, that feels good," when again we started, still in view of those we were following. The Confederate regiments began to withdraw from the stone wall, with parts of Tyler's brigade pursuing as much as they could in the growing darkness. Confederates scattered in all different directions as Federal cavalry scoured the fields and forests around where the fighting took place. Jackson attempted to rally and reinforce his men, but it was all in vain. His brigades found their way to the Valley Pike and started heading south. Close to Newton, Jackson and his aides sat near a fire, exhausted after a long day. A young artilleryman commented to Jackson, "General, it looks like you cut off more tobacco today than you could chew," to which Jackson replied, "Oh, I think we did very well." Out of around 8,500 troops engaged, the Union lost 118 killed, 450 wounded, and 22 captured or missing, for a total of 590. Out of around 3,800 troops engaged, the Confederacy lost 80 killed, 375 wounded, and 263 captured or missing, for a total of 718. Although the battle ended in defeat for Jackson, it accomplished a huge strategic goal for the Confederacy. Until the Battle of Kernstown, Nathaniel Banks was shifting troops further east to protect Washington, D.C., and give support to George McClellan's planned Peninsula campaign. The strong presence made by Jackson signaled to Union forces that he was very much a threat and was still in the valley. This made the Union High Command rethink their overall strategy in the Eastern Theater.